I'm Dr. David Jansen.
I'm Michael Sanders.
I am Noelle Thrasher.
And welcome to the Highlander Podyssey. Hello, thank you so much for joining us on The Podyssey, a podcast by Gordon State students. I'm your podcast host, Michael Sanders. Today, we're listening to Jacob Rivera. In this podcast, Jacob breaks down writing in the context of being a game master in Dungeons & Dragons. He talks about the importance of world building through subtlety, how the GM and players write the story collaboratively. My favorite part is where he talks about making in-the-moment snap writing decisions when the players don't quite do what you expect them to, and how those are some of the best moments of the game. All right, let's get into it.
Hello, my name is Jacob Rivera, and welcome to Gordon State College's Podyssey, I believe is what we are naming it. My episode here is to talk about the creative potential and the endless possibilities when it comes to storytelling in Dungeons & Dragons, or just tabletop RPGs as a whole. I have several talking points, but before I really absolutely get into it, just a little bit of a history lesson. Storytelling, as it is and as we know it, goes back 30,000 years to whether it is oral presentators or if it is just cave paintings inside some domain of a caveman. And we as humans, for 30,000 years, 5,000 years, 10 years, have always resonated with stories. Storytelling as a whole is a way to distract, it's a way to calm, it's a way to just eke away at whatever is going on in the outside world and just let yourself be distracted for just a moment. And so I think that's encapsulated with the modern fascination with tabletop RPGs, specifically Dungeons & Dragons. There are many modern examples of how well this is correlated, be it Critical Role, Dimension 20, Dungeons and Daddies. There are plenty out there for anyone to find and just get lost in. I have several bullet points here that I want to talk about and possibly add in a few anecdotes of my own. First off, essentially what I started with, world building and creative storytelling possibilities. As a creative storyteller, Dungeons & Dragons is an absolute goldmine to flex your creative muscles however you wish to do so. Whether it's creating the entire world from scratch and adding in all the little villages, all the kingdoms, all the NPCs, non-player characters that inhabit those, it is really a creative's playground. And you can play with it however you wish. Perhaps you have a kingdom somewhere that on the outside looking in looks fairly normal, fairly high fantasy, but underneath there's probably some cult stuff going on. Maybe they're worshiping a dragon that's 10,000 years old and they're sacrificing innocence of the populace, and you have to tell that to your characters in very subtle ways for them to find it out. That's just off the top of my head, but that's a way you can include creative storytelling into the whole process. It's a very challenging endeavor, creating an entire world as a creative, but it is so worthwhile because you get to make this living, breathing world, and you get to show that off to, be it your friends or publishers or whomever else. It's honestly endless. You can make the world as big as you want it, as small as you want it. You can extend it to however many villages, however many towns, however many characters. It's so much fun to do, and it's something I strongly encourage. World building is absolutely something I think every creative should indulge in. That also leads into my next point, which are the wonderful and meaningful story beats that you can have with your players. My favorite thing as a dungeon master is being able to connect with my players one-on-one. And I love being able to take the backstories that they give me, be it a paragraph long or 12 pages long, and incorporate that into the story some way, somehow. And it's all told through the dice. And let's say some player wants to find their mother, and they go on this incredulous journey. It's my job as the storyteller to make that story that they gave me and turn it into this engaging high fantasy adventure. It doesn't have to necessarily be high fantasy, but this adventure to find their mother, told through very engaging role play and the rolls of the dice. Speaking of the dice, that really encapsulates how well you can improv and do storytelling. Because let's say I have a player of mine who is searching for their mother. Roll an investigation check, and this is a very, very necessary investigation check. And the DC is like 20, we'll say, for time's sake. And they roll a 19. Well, that's considered a failure. And so I would have to tell them, story-wise, that they didn't find what they were looking for, and they would have to branch their story on their own, and I would have to help them. Now, say they roll a 21. Well, that's awesome. They succeed. They find what they're looking for, and I help them continue their story on into finding their mother. It also helps, and I already briefly touched on this with roleplay, when you are engaging with your characters in a story that both you and them care about, it is some of the most meaningful story beats and most meaningful moments that you can have as not only an author, but just a person. If you are a dungeon master, you are playing hundreds of different characters, but for one of your players, they're just playing one, typically. And so, as an actor, it's easy to dip in and out of different roles. But if that's something you're not accustomed to, you have to be prepared to get into the mindset of a character that you helped create or that you created solely on your own. Flip that and start talking to your or to your player's character and making that moment matter. Whether if you are embodying the player's mother or if you are embodying some monarch somewhere and you're telling them that no, they can't be on your land or whatever it might be. Engaging, making that eye contact, and telling a collaborative story is a high like no other. And doing that with like-minded creatives who want to be there as much as you is so much fun, dice failure or no. And so next point kind of ties into that a little bit, but crafting and collaborating one grandiose story with your players. And so I've already kind of touched on this a little bit with roleplay and personal side quests, but there is one large overarching story to this entire thing. And you give that to your players. And so for me personally, I go by this rule I call 90-10. The story is 10% mine, 90% theirs. I write it, I set it up, and what they do with it is what they do with it. And so I can give them this fully fleshed out world with a very obvious bad guy, and they can take it in a total different direction and run with it if they so choose. And my job as a DM is to work with that, collaborate with that, and help form a story how it needs to be formed. And so typically it doesn't go off the rails too much. There are times where that does happen. I think, as a personal anecdote, one of my favorites that I think back to is I was running a Star Wars tabletop for a group of friends of mine, and they ran into a group of stormtroopers. And the whole idea was that they were supposed to talk to them and find out that, oh, these stormtroopers are actually children and they need to save these children. Well, unfortunately, they didn't do that. They decided to not ask questions and go about their way, which completely cut off an entire plot line that I had set up for this planet that they were on. And it really, really just threw a wrench into a lot of things. And so I kept trying to guide them back to it, but it wasn't something that they were wanting to do. And so ultimately that plot point was abandoned, and I had to find a workaround into creating a more elaborate story that they would mesh with. I think another one from that very same campaign was I had written a character that was just a guard on a planet they were on. And the whole idea was that he was, not so secretly, but he was married to one of the main character's sisters, but they didn't know that. Because the sister was missing, he was looking for said sister. And so I teed that up. I was like, okay, so here's this character. He knows where your sister is. In fact, he's her husband. And so I had this whole backstory, this whole background, this whole plot line of how to save this character, get him back, and reuniting the family. It was so much fun. And then my player throws me a curveball and insists on, for lack of a better term, deleting that character from existence. And so I had to just deal with that and let my player character effectively kill this character. And so I had to delete pages of backstory, pages of plot, but ultimately it turned out okay. It was painful for me as the writer of all of this, but it made for a lasting memory and one that I thought was really fun. And so that's just a little moment, and the large, vast amount of storytelling potential that you can have and that you have to deal with as a DM. You get constant curveballs, whether it be from a player choice or an inopportune dice roll. I've had player characters make choices that come out of left field, and I've just had to deal with it in so many different ways. I've had dice rolls that were not supposed to fail, and I would have to come up with different ways to go about things. And so it's not easy. It's not easy being able to be engaged with something that you've created and let that be effectively torn apart by your friends who are playing with you, for good or for worse. Because, as I've mentioned, this is a living and breathing world, and they are playing around in it. You are essentially watching children play in a sandbox that you built yourself, and just really, really hoping that they do not hurt themselves or what you've built. And so it's a really fun project when it comes to creating and when it comes to a lesser extent, micromanagement. And so the last point that I would like to touch on, encapsulating all of this, is that when it comes to creating all of this, embodying, telling the stories of, and creating sometimes over 100 characters is one of the most fun, but one of the hardest things that you do as a DM or someone that is creating this world. Because embodying the characters, for one, you have to be able to switch. I can be an elven merchant one second, and then I have to be a bugbear mercenary in another. And it has to be quick, and you have to make those differences. And now maybe this is the actor in me coming out, but you have to make those physical differences. You have to make those vocal differences. Maybe the elven merchant is about up here, whereas the bugbear's a bit down here. You know, you have to be able to do that really quickly so that your characters know. And you also have to be prepared, whether it's these characters having names and having brief backstories. Because, and let me tell you, this has happened a million times for me, and it's going to happen a million times more. I'm going to have a random merchant show up, and one of my players is going to say, what's that merchant's name? What is their backstory? Who is their wife? How many children do they have? They do it every single time. And so I don't write 12 pages per NPC because I'd be doing that all night. But having a brief readiness and just stuff ready to go is so important, and it's so worthwhile because again, you're going to be asked, it's going to happen, but it's also a great exercise. And I think it's really, really wonderful, especially if you intend on publishing your world. The last point of all of this was the creating sometimes over 100 characters, which I've done, and I think the best possible way that you do it isn't even when you prepare, isn't even when you spend all these late nights creating. It's when you do it in the moment. Because more often than not, your players will say something like, oh, is there anybody on the street? Is there a merchant nearby? Is there an inn nearby? Is there a person in this alleyway? And oftentimes you'll be like, yes, this is a character I haven't created. And so you go through all of those creative cogs in your brain at that time, create a character. You think, okay, this is a tiefling. He is a male. Why is he in this alleyway? His name is Gerald. I don't know. And so you do this really quickly. They ask, is there anyone in this alleyway? You're like, yes, it's this purple tiefling named Gerald. What do you want with him? And that's just something I made up in the moment. And that's kind of an example of what you have to do in the moment. And I think it's an absolutely wonderful thing for anybody that loves that kind of thing. It's so much fun. And what you're able to do with your friends, your players, what you're able to do with a world that you create is such a, for lack of a better term, vacation from the real world, because you get to explore this vast creation that you made with people who love you, and collaborative storytelling and what you get to bring to the table in a TTRPG space is some of the most fun I think I've ever had, and I think I'm going to have. And I would like to end this off by saying that I would strongly encourage, if you even have an inkling of wanting to play Dungeons & Dragons or any TTRPG, do it. It will change your life with how much fun it is, with how much fun you're willing to have with your friends, your family, whomever. It is such a joy, and I myself can't wait until I play again.
Thank you so much for listening. This podcast was written by and features Jacob Rivera, executive producer Noel Thrasher, audio engineering and recording by Elizabeth Hill, audio editing by me, Michael Sanders, intro and outro music written by me, Michael Sanders, with help from Dr. David Jansen featured on guitar, interim music titled Akita Cheetah, written by Kevin MacLeod. And as always, Highlanders forward. Keep reading, gang.